specific topic in order to give some insight of how the things in the journalist system are working right now. I'm really happy to, for your presence here. This is the last event of the Festival of Diplomacy. So it was interesting to have all this participation of the students. And also I thank the presence of professors, journalists, and all the organization of the Central American Studies that make all of this possible, and also for the other venues, the European Commission and the European Parliament. Now I will leave the floor to the journalist, Philip William, that will start this last conference. William, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
I'll use this for safety to be sure that you can all hear. Well, welcome. This is a splendid setting for us to meet and talk in. It's tough to compete with the topic of intelligence and counterterrorism next door, but hopefully journalism has its interesting aspects as well. And obviously, if any of you are thinking about a career in journalism, it's useful to hear about other people's experiences and get an idea of what the profession involves these days. I'll talk a bit about my own experience and then journalism in general as I see it today. And then I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the talk. So I currently am a freelance journalist, and I contribute to the Times, but I'm not actually the main Times correspondent. So I contribute occasionally to the paper, and I am concentrating on writing investigative books as my main activity, the activity that interests me most, although it's also a difficult one to maintain discipline. And, if you have distractions, switching between current news and your long-term research, you need to be very disciplined in how you organize your time. In fact, my discipline has been a bit lax recently. I started working as a journalist in the early 1980s in Rome on an American newspaper here that served the local community and was distributed throughout Italy and to a certain extent in the rest of the Mediterranean region. It was called the International Daily News, and it was founded by a man called Robert Cunningham Jr., who was the son of Robert Cunningham Sr., who had worked for the American military newspaper Stars and Stripes, and he then founded a rival Rome newspaper called the Rome Daily American, and he also worked for the CIA. So it was a sign of American interest in what was going on in the Mediterranean region, and particularly what was going on in Italy at the time, where you had the largest communist party in Western Europe and considerable concern that the communists might win an election at the ballot box and come to power in a NATO country. So the American foreign policy establishment was very interested in what was going on in Italy. And in fact, curiously, at a certain point, the Daily American was bought by the financier Michele Sindona. I don't know if it's a name that means anything to you. He was a Sicilian financier who bought control of a number of banks, including the Franklin National Bank in the United States and a bank in Italy. And the Franklin National Bank went bankrupt at a certain point. I think at the time, around 1974, I think it was the biggest bank failure in United States history at that point. And Sindona was a very controversial figure with links to the mafia. He, at a certain point when his business empire was in trouble, he organized his own fake kidnap and disappeared to Sicily, where he was a guest of various mafia connections that he had on the island. And he then reappeared in the United States, having spent his time apparently as a kidnap victim, trying to blackmail people into helping him and threatening to reveal sensitive secrets that he had acquired in the course of his work as an international banker, including in particular people who'd violated Italian currency laws and illegally exported currency outside of Italy with the help of Sindona and his banks. And he reappeared in New York and attempted to make the story of his kidnap appear more convincing by getting a doctor to shoot him in the leg to try and convince people that he had been genuinely in the hands of dangerous kidnappers. But in actual fact, it had all been a plot that he had organized himself. So he's an interesting character, and he's one of these very sort of checkered figures who featured in how the United States at the time operated to try and keep the Communist Party at bay in Italy. My introduction then to investigative journalism. The International Daily News was a daily newspaper with cultural pages and sport, and the majority of the material in it came from US and international news wires. At the time, they were AP, UPI, and Reuters were the principal sources of news, and the news would come in on a sort of teleprinter, and you'd rip off the paper and edit the stories as they appeared, printed out from the machine, compose a headline, and distribute the length of words that were needed to fill the pages of the newspaper. And so I worked with that paper for a couple of years and then went freelance. And my introduction to investigative journalism was when I was at the Foreign Press Club here in Rome. And there was a notice board where people put announcements for things that could be of interest to the members of the club. And there was an announcement from a man who was about to embark on an investigative book about the death of Pope John Paul I, Papa Luciani. And his name was David Yallop. So I responded to this notice on the board and went to meet him in the bar on Piazza Barberini, and had a first discussion with him. And the thesis of his book was that Pope John Paul I had been murdered. And so that was the subject of our investigation. And there were numerous theories as to why John Paul I might have been murdered. And it was a theory that had been discussed in the international media, and particularly in the Italian media, because he died of an apparent heart attack after just 33 days in office. And he'd been in conflict with some of his colleagues in the Vatican over church policy and appointments. And in particular, he had always taken a hard line on financial probity. And the Vatican had been, the reputation of the Vatican had been somewhat tarnished by involvement in financial scandals in Italy, including contacts with Michele Sindona, who helped to handle Vatican investments. And the head of the Vatican Bank, the Institute for the Works of Religion, at that time was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who was an American of Lithuanian origin from Chicago, if I remember right. And he had pursued business contacts with disreputable people, Sindona, then after Sindona, Roberto Calvi, the head of the Banco Ambrosiano, who in 1982 was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. Again, another story that you may have heard of or read about. So I helped Jalap to investigate this topic, and to my mind, the most plausible motive for the murder of the Pope would have been to prevent him clamping down on financial malpractice within the Vatican itself and at the Vatican Bank. And when I started the research, I was extremely skeptical about the notion that the Pope had been murdered. But as we went along and interviewed people, the Pope's secretaries and other people who'd known the Pope and some of his relatives, I got an increasingly strong feeling that something odd had happened and that people were not being candid. Not everybody who spoke to us was being candid about what they knew, and there were also contradictory accounts coming from different individuals who were familiar with the story, to such an extent that I did, by the end of the research that we'd done, come to be fairly convinced that there was a real possibility that the Pope had been murdered, and that the financial motive was the most plausible explanation for why he might have been murdered. Since then, I've slipped back into agnosticism on this subject. So I don't have a clear conviction of what happened, and certainly I don't think that Jalap's book, which was called In God's Name and became a great bestseller, it's an international bestseller when it came out, it doesn't conclusively prove his case that the Pope was murdered, but it certainly made a splash, and it introduced me to the world of the Vatican Bank, the temporal power of the Vatican at that time, an organization that was itself somewhat split between conservative forces who were very strongly anti-communist because the church in Eastern Europe was being persecuted by communist regimes, atheist communist regimes in Russia and in the satellite countries of Eastern Europe. So they had a natural reason for allying themselves with Western countries who were opposed to communism, particularly to the United States. But at the same time, the church itself was divided, and there were worker priests, and the theology of liberation in Latin America. So priests who were very sympathetic to the plight of the poor and potentially also sympathetic to socialist or communist approaches to politics. The experience of working with Yalop also introduced me to the P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy, which was a very powerful organization, clearly set up under the auspices of the CIA at the time to combat communism in Italy and also more widely around the world. And it became extremely influential. You had top people from the military, top people from the secret services, top people from the police, the magistrates, journalism, and politicians, all members of this club that dictated a lot of what happened in Italy at that time, and which was only officially discovered in, I think it was 1981, when the membership lists were found at the offices of the head of the organization, who was called Licio Gelli. And so they were extremely influential with an extremely sinister role, and suspected of being implicated in the terrorism that went on in Italy at that time, both right-wing terrorism, where you had, in particular, bombing atrocities in 1969 in a bank in Milan, where numerous people were killed, on trains and in railway stations, culminating in the 1980 bombing in Bologna railway station, which killed 85 people and injured a very large number of people. But also there was a theory that explained what was happening, the strategy of tension, that by creating anxiety and fear, people would turn to the political parties that represented order and security and reassurance for people who were fearful, and therefore they would vote in particular for the Christian Democrat Party, which was the dominant centrist party at the time. And they're following on from the right-wing terrorism. There was the terrorism of the Red Brigades, which equally increased the sense of insecurity. It was a more targeted terrorism that aimed at specific individuals, police officers or magistrates. And in that case, it culminated in the kidnapping of Aldo Moro, who was the chairman of the Christian Democrat Party, a former prime minister. And he was, his motorcade was blocked on a street in Rome, and his bodyguards were all murdered, and he was seized, and he was held for 55 days by the Red Brigades as a prisoner while they negotiated over his possible release, in particular seeking some kind of official recognition from the government that they were in themselves a political organization with a right to be, to have a role in some sense in the Italian, on the Italian political scene, despite being a terrorist organization that had killed a lot of people and continued to kill people. And after these 55 days of negotiations, he was shot dead and his body was left in the boot of a car, actually in Via Caetani, just outside here. And there's a plaque honoring him, which is just above the spot where his car, where the car and his body were abandoned. And again, some people interpret the consequences of the left-wing terrorism as well as helping to destabilize the country, ultimately to stabilize it with a reliably anti-communist, centrist government, more firmly in command. And it's a very complex story, but it's been discussed since those days, and there's still not complete consensus about how these events should be interpreted. But there is, I think, a growing sensation that sinister forces like P2, which wanted to preserve a conservative, reliably anti-communist regime, were involved and were pulling the strings to some extent in what happened, and also the role of the CIA in all of that is much discussed. Going on from my experience with the Alap's book, I helped another journalist called Charles Raw to write a book about the Banco Ambrosiano scandal. And he had access to a lot of financial documents relating to the bankruptcy of the Banco Ambrosiano, and reconstructed in great detail the connections between Roberto Calvi and Archbishop Marcinkus at the Vatican Bank. And he wrote a great heavy tome on this subject called The Money Changers. And it was interesting because on one occasion we went together to interview Licio Gelli at his home outside Arezzo in Tuscany. And Charles Raw asked him a lot of questions about the financial dealings that he himself had in connection with the Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican. And Gelli would happily answer the questions, but not telling the truth. And Raw had access to the bank documents that demonstrated that what he was saying was untrue. But Gelli was never fazed by the need when it was necessary to lie. He lied very smoothly and convincingly. And at the end of our conversation with him, we went out into the garden of Gelli's villa and posed for photographs together in front of an area of the garden containing flower boxes. And many years later, it would be discovered that Gelli had a large collection of gold bars that were hidden in these flower boxes behind the scene where we took the photo. And as we were saying goodbye, Gelli said to Raw that if he was ever in the area again, you should come and visit him again. He's welcome to come and have coffee with him. And that if he was in London, he would do the same. And there was no idea that Raw actually wanted to invite him to come to his house for coffee. And it seemed like a threatening message that if I want to find you, I know how to find you. I can find you at any time. So moving on from that experience, I then myself wrote 2 books up till now. One on terrorism in Italy, published now very many years ago, called Puppet Masters, about the manipulation of terrorism by other forces. And then a book on the Calvi case as well, whether he was murdered or committed suicide under the bridge in London, and moving on from the knowledge that I'd acquired working for Raw and before that for David Yallop. So that's been the most, to my mind at least, the most interesting part of my experience. But over the years, I've also written about current news for different news organizations, moving on from the International Daily News. And I've written for many of the major newspapers in the UK. I also have some years wrote for an agency covering IT and telecommunications called IDG News Service. And now the main thing that I do in current journalism is writing periodically for the Times. So one can see what the news editors in London are looking for from the different countries that where they have correspondents. And in the case of Italy, particularly when the news in the rest of the world is grim, which it is a lot of the time now, they look to Italy for light relief, funny stories, culture, the Vatican, articles that will mock up with nice photographs, and basically something that will take people's minds off war here and war there. And so often crime stories, and the normal routine is that you read the day's newspapers fairly early in the morning, send in your proposals around 10 o'clock in the morning with a sort of brief summary of what you're pitching, maybe 5 or 6 topics or less if there's not much going on. And then the foreign desk get back to you and order the story or stories that they want for the day, and they give you a specific word count, the length of stories that they want. So writing about Italy is, on the whole, is very stimulating and agreeable. And my colleague writes reams and reams about the latest discoveries in Pompeii, anything that happens in Venice, and that's of great interest to readers in the UK. And it's an interesting and varied beat. And I think probably, particularly in the past, in the Cold War, it was a country with one of the most dynamic and complicated histories, with a lot going on underneath the surface, with the presence of the Vatican and the geostrategic interests of the Vatican, the very strong interest of the United States, and the largest communist party in Western Europe, financed by the Soviet Union and competing for power here. So it was a very complex, very troubled time for Italy, and still quite mysterious. A lot of extreme actions went on, organized crime playing an important role in the story as well. And people are still piecing together the story now, fitting in new pieces of the mosaic and creating a fuller picture of what happened, which I think is very important for any country, that they should know as much as possible about their history so they can avoid making mistakes, the same mistakes for a second time. In the course of the years that I've worked in journalism, the profession has evolved in a way that hasn't always been advantageous to people working in the profession. You now have competition with social media, you have citizen journalists, the financial situation of most of my colleagues is now much less good than when I started. When I started, the major newspapers would have a full-time correspondent in Rome, and the major television companies as well. In many cases, they would have a very good salary. Their rent would be paid for them with maybe a flat on the Piazza di Spagna or some luxurious location in the center of Rome. Now there are far fewer people with that kind of pampered treatment, and many of my colleagues are young freelancers who are paid by the story that they write, so they have to churn out as many stories as they can, possibly to many different publications, selling to many different publications, and so they're, their heads down at the grindstone. The other thing that has changed the life of the correspondent for a daily newspaper is that with the internet and the main newspapers having their own website, if you worked for a news agency, as I did for a while for UPI, you were constantly updating stories and filing new stories, and it never stopped throughout the day. If you were a newspaper correspondent, you did maybe one story a day, and you took take your time to do it, interview people, go out, look for information, gather information outside the office. But now many colleagues complain that they have to feed the website of their newspaper, so they have very little time to do original reporting. They're rewriting other agencies. So that also has changed the existence of at least foreign correspondence here in Rome. In order to leave some time for questions, I can perhaps just wrap up, particularly for any of you thinking that you might be interested in doing journalism, that it's possibly more important now than it has ever been, because there's been this extraordinary loss of confidence in sources of information and in authority. And the mainstream news organizations are now competing with whatever anybody wants to put out there on X or Facebook or on their own personal blog. And people are just inundated with information, often confirming their own biases because they go to the sites where they know they'll find people or information that they already agree with. So finding impartial, seriously reported and seriously investigated sources of news is probably more important than it has ever been before. And as a citizen, but also as a journalist, you need to defend yourself from fake news and people are lying to you, working out what the parameters are for what you believe, and ways of trying to get at the truth and pass on a reliable truth to other people. And the final consideration, if any of you are considering going into journalism, in my view, the best formula is to develop a specialism on a topic that you're really interested in, so that you can become the top expert on that subject. And then you can dominate a niche while also covering wider topics in general. And if you can get the right balance between writing books, say, and doing daily journalism, that is a satisfying formula. And perhaps the cushiest formula of all is academics who have their academic niche. It's a topic that is of interest more generally, so they can write books about it, and they can also write for the news organizations or do television. One person I can think of who I've met who has arrived at this very sort of ideal combination of irons in the fire is a British academic and journalist called John Dickey, who's written some very good books about the mafia, and he presents television series. He has numerous books, and he has a salary from one of the universities in London. So, you know, not everybody is dying of hunger, but if you go into journalism, it's worth being aware that the finances of journalism are precarious now, and so it's wise to look for a good formula that will work for you. So with that, I will throw open the floor to questions, but maybe I could just ask a question first myself. How many of you would be thinking of going into journalism, if any? All down this end of the room, 5. Right. Okay, and there were lots of questions too, so who'd like to start? Yes. Patty, if you could say your name to start with. Well, if you speak louder, that's probably fine.
Being here, my name is Aisha, and I'm also a global student. So my question is very short and simple. How do you find and select the topics of your materials? And do you have any personal rules or philosophy that you adhere to in your work? That's my question.
Thank you. If you're thinking of material for books, research for books, rather than for the newspaper, the daily newspaper, or both. Yeah, I mean, for the daily newspaper, your starting point is Italian news agencies, Italian newspapers and magazines, and also radio and television. So that's your starting point. In terms of research for books, if it's something to do with Italy's Cold War history, for example, there are enormous quantity of books already written by other people, an enormous amount of documentation generated by judicial investigations and trials. And then, of course, from reading about the subject, you can identify who the potentially useful sources, original sources are that you could go to and speak to them in person. And between all of those elements, you have to choose what the promising and important parts of the story are and concentrate on them, because the story can be too vast that you could write not just a book but an encyclopedia, and most people don't have time to do that. Other questions? Yes. Yeah. Okay.
My name is Andrzej Chudikowski. I'm from Global Governance, like the rest here. And how many questions can we ask you individually? Because I have a few.
Well, let's start with two and
Okay.
give other people a chance as well.
How does freelance journalism compare to working full-time in a media company? Because I've heard that a lot of journalists have gone freelance recently, mainly because according to them, a lot of media companies have a certain agenda that they want to push, and freelance journalism gives them more freedom to work with what they want. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but you said that if we want to be journalists, we should specialize in a certain topic. What area do you specialize in as a journalist?
Well, my area is Cold War history of Italy and conspiracies and skullduggery that went on in that period from the 1970s through to the end of the 1980s, say. I don't know that people moving from mainstream news organizations to go freelance, it can be put down to any one or few explanations. One, I think, is lack of funding and people losing their jobs because there isn't enough money to support the big news organizations that existed in the past. But it could well be that if you're a freelance, you do have greater freedom, that you can propose stories to publications that will accept and handle a particular topic, which might not always be the case in a mainstream news organization. And obviously, it's clear that the ownership of the major news organizations does influence the political line of the newspaper or television, obviously. So you have to sort of work within the parameters, but often newsrooms, as a matter of personal pride and dignity, will want to cover something that is a valid news story, even if it's disturbing to the Rupert Murdoch or whoever the owner of the organization might be. I know that in the past, when I was starting out in my career, and I think perhaps to some extent still, there were numerous cases of journalists for the main newspapers in London doing research for stories that were very, very delicate and sensitive, and where there was a high risk of being sued for libel. And if their news editors wouldn't accept and wouldn't publish the stories, they would pass them anonymously to a satirical magazine that still exists called Private Eye. And so a lot of the stories that were too sensitive for the main newspapers did find an outlet, and one way of getting around the censorship would be to publish things anonymously. Clearly, another way is to be freelance and offer to the publication that you know is right for the particular topic that you want to offer. Yes?
What I'm interested is more the news that are more political, which are not really explored, and right now it's very unhopeful to go towards that path. Because while I was fact checking the news, sometimes the future was dying on level. So it's not only a level news case. We can talk about Myanmar, we can talk about everywhere else in the world. There's so much of darkness, and especially with AI and all these new factors that affect. Even if you write without your medium and everything, if you write discreetly, I think journalists all around the world are not protected. That's personal opinion. You might be privileged and protected if you write anonymously, but how can you encourage journalists when you see all those mistreatment that is happening to them? And how do you protect that kind of hope and inspire youth writers?
Yes, I think where the circumstances are very difficult and dangerous, it is hard to convince people. You need to find people who have a real sense of vocation, but particularly if people recognize the importance of what they do, that it's vital to have accurate information if you want to have a free society. So if people working as journalists in war zones, clearly the risk can be very high, and there's no way of guaranteeing people's safety. But you have to hope that there are sufficient number of idealistic people who will take the risk and then try to do the maximum possible to protect them. And certainly there are specific things that you can learn in terms of handling data in a safe way, preserving the anonymity of your sources, people who are really doing frontline investigative journalism in very dangerous places, have all sorts of tricks that they need to learn, and which I personally haven't had to do that. But yes, I mean, it really is essential that you still have people who believe enough in this activity to take the risks and risk their lives to bring the story out. Yes, at the end.
I'm also a student of global governance, like everyone else here. And I wanted to ask if there was any instance in your career, especially while writing, your book Puppet Masters, for example, about the, U.S. government's involvement in, I read the short lore about it, it's incredibly interesting. Is there any moment where you felt, or you were frightened, or your career was threatened, or you felt unsafe from either one of the violent groups that you're writing about? And secondly, I asked this question as well to Thomas, who also gave a talk to us, who's joining the Associated Press. Do you think that there is any place anymore, or do you think that journalism these days will be taking a shift towards more space for opinion-based journalism? Do you think that it's more productive to have opinions-based journalism that instead of an attempt to have quote-unquote facts-based journalism in a day and age when quote-unquote facts are disputed and the truth is multifaceted?
Yes, I'll answer the second question first. I think that the basic rule of separating facts from opinions is very valid. And is a sort of staple rule of journalism since when I started. It is true that the people are now invaded by facts in inverted commas, and maybe a good way of responding to that is authoritative opinions, including facts, but clarifying and giving context. But I think it's essential that people have access to facts reliably reported in news organizations with a good reputation, and also a variety of sources, so you don't have to rely just on one, because even the most prestigious news organizations make mistakes and can also be influenced by prejudice of the individual journalist or the owners and the editors. So a variety of sources of information, but possibly with this constant sort of white noise of so-called facts, authoritative opinion is more valuable than ever as a sort of antidote. In terms of my own personal safety, I think in the early years when I did the research for Puppet Masters, I was conscious that it was a very delicate subject, and that there was potentially a degree of risk attached to it. I think I had the advantage of being a foreign journalist in Italy, so if something happened to me, it would be likely to cause a bigger media scandal than if something happened to a local Italian journalist. But it was interesting that how things have evolved over the years, because I interviewed Licio Gelli on probably 4 or 5 occasions over the years. And the first time I went on my own with a tape recorder, and I was very young, and he had a very sulfurous reputation as being behind numerous murders, behind terrorist events. So I was pretty nervous when I visited him, always in his villa outside Arezzo. In actual fact, in person, he was a very kind of mild-mannered, not very impressive character. He, he could seem like a relatively low-level bank clerk, and he liked to try and impress you with his sophistication and knowledge, but actually wasn't that impressive in the way he carried it out. But over the years, going back to talk to him, and the first time he on the sensitive topics, he was very cagey, and he didn't give anything away because they were sensitive. But as time went on, I returned to interview him with television colleagues on a couple of occasions. And at that point, he'd been retired for many years and obviously wasn't actively involved in conspiracies anymore. And I think he was probably, he was an elderly man living on his own. He was a bit lonely, and he really enjoyed the attention, and especially if you put a camera on him, his vanity came out, and he loved to talk. And he also would tell you things that he would never have told you 10 years before, 20 years before. So things evolved in that way. I haven't, there were numerous occasions when I felt that topics were particularly sensitive, and so I was nervous. I wasn't sort of openly threatened in the course of my career. There was one occasion when I was looking into an aspect of a very complicated aspect of the Moro kidnapping, and one of the people that I spoke to, I can't remember now, it was possibly a lawyer. He said, if you insist on this particular avenue of research, somebody will shoot you in the mouth. And that was fairly clear. And in fact, it discouraged me from pursuing that particular aspect of the story at the time.
Just follow up to your first question. So you said that authoritative opinion is good when it comes to journalism. For working for, I would say, big outlets or like big, reputable journalism centers, for example, like any journalism organization, any publicist, any publication that, claims to only report the facts. Do you think it's important who journalists are to people, or just in their writing and their ability to synthesize and just tell what they hear? Does it even matter if there's people anymore and there's no place for opinion?
Well, no, I think there is a place for opinion, and I think inevitably, even if you try to keep the opinion to a minimum, the facts that you choose to report, there's always something of yourself in it. And definitely, if you have people working who are decent, moral people who believe in what they're doing, that's extremely important, because not all journalists are like that. And it's good that, to have as many people who are inspired by an ideal and appreciate the importance of what they're doing. So for sure, the people are important, and that's a complete opinion or prejudice-free facts are, I don't think they exist. Yes.
I want to ask that since you mentioned some news about Vatican and some news about kidnapped people, have you ever covered the topic of Emanuela? I don't know.
Orlandi.
So, like, what was the structure? And I'm basically just curious about that topic, so I wanted to ask.
Yes, I did cover it because it comes into the context of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, because there's a theory that Emanuele Orlandi was kidnapped by representatives of Rome underworld gang because they had lost money that was being laundered through the Vatican Bank, and that this was a way to put pressure on the Vatican to get the money back. That's just one theory as to what happened. And because it related to what I was writing about on Calvi, I included it in the book. So I did look into that aspect, and I think there is a certain plausibility to it, and Archbishop Marcinkus is mentioned in the context of that. I don't know if you've seen the very well done Netflix series, which that I think had a big impact because it told the story in a very clear, straightforward way for people who didn't know anything about it at all. And a lot of the elements were very shocking for people who didn't know anything about it. So I have covered it, and I've spoken to other people who've worked on it, and I've also met Emanuela's brother Pietro on several occasions, and he's been an extraordinary dogged, courageous figure in fighting for the truth about his sister for all these years, and he still hasn't given up, and equally he hasn't received satisfactory information that he was looking for.
It was talking about military if the whole stuff has anything to do with him, or it's just like some kind of attention that they're trying to take to different sides?
It's difficult to say, but it does seem that the Aja connection sort of jumped on the opportunity to exploit the mystery of this missing girl. So I think also I've read in the past documents illustrating that representatives of the East German Secret Service also jumped on the opportunity to create confusion and blackmail, and the many opportunists jumped onto the mystery. So it still remains very murky. Some questions from down this end. You've been neglected.
question connected with media more than
Mhm.
I'm from Russia, and previously, like a decade ago, every citizen was watching TV because it was like a very informative and comfortable source of media to know the news. But since the current situation, I'm not gonna like explain because everybody knows what I'm talking about. Nobody is watching television, and everybody prefers independent media, such as YouTube bloggers or Telegram channels. And I just wanted to ask you, do you think that in some years, and not only in Russia, the situation is similar to Europe as well. Now people don't watch TV. People prefer to watch Netflix on their laptops or through social media. So the question is, do you think that TV will not be in demand in some years? It will disappear completely?
Yes, I think that's a good question. I think it's true that especially younger people don't watch television much or any more, and also don't look to television for the news. They possibly don't read the newspapers either. But yes. Yes, I mean that is a challenge, obviously, for the television companies that could be going out of business if they don't get people back, get their public back. Yes, I mean there are very many factors at play. In Italy, I probably still quite a lot of people, maybe older people, do watch television and get their news from the television. And in other European countries as well, or Western European countries, that they still have a certain credibility that, particularly for the older generation. But yes, that could be a challenge for the future of at least television news programs and television in general. And obviously, it's a challenge that people who look for sources of information that they can trust on internet. Obviously, if they're well informed and they discuss with other people and they know what to look out for in terms of fake news and compare one source of information with another to sort of protect themselves from being duped. People can find their way through the maze and get sources of information that they feel they can trust. But I think it's not easy, and the situation is so chaotic, and especially the tendency, if people have strong prejudices already themselves, they will simply go to the sources of information that confirm their prejudice. And so everybody is operating in their little bubble, and that's not good for a well-informed public and well-informed electorate.
I agree, but do you think that now we can trust television because it depends on government? Do you think that do you agree with this statement?
I don't think that statement is true across the board. It depends on which country you're talking about, and it depends whether it's commercial television or state controlled. I mean, in Italy, there's a lot of controversy now because there's a far right government that has been putting its own people into the controlling positions in state television, and there's a lot of concern that they want to sort of take over the media scene, at least in the state-controlled part of it, and their allies already, the Mediaset, is connected to Forza Italia that is represented in the government. And I mean, they're almost now a kind of moderate opposition source of news in relation to the sort of harder right-wing elements of the government. But that's is a big issue. But it depends which country you're talking about. I think the BBC in England is very much criticized, but it is still seen as a reliable source of information. And it has a long tradition of being critical of whoever is in power, that there's a sense that the journalist should be the guard dog of democracy, and so they should be critical of whoever is in power. And when it's a new government, they're critical of that government. I think the BBC has maintained that tradition. You're not convinced. You're not convinced.
No, no.
Uh,
On television, for me, it's something impossible to have. Television that is not controlled by government, because all my life I own TV and I don't know if it's true or fake.
Yeah, well, I think in Western countries, the television, particularly in the United States, will be controlled by commercial interests, and so that influences what gets broadcast. But the commercial interests are varied, and they may be in competition with one another. So you have a broad picture, if not a fantastically rich one. About? Well, I think there as well, there's a rather residual state television, and then major business interests that control the television channels. So, yeah, France is well, nearly all of the major European countries are in difficulty for one reason or another these days in terms of how the democracy works, the level of social conflict, how the economy is doing. Western society is really in a bad moment, risking tearing itself apart with very radically opposed ideas. Maybe United States at the moment, the most extreme example of that. So yeah, some voices of reason reaching out to a wide readership or basin of listeners is more important than ever. Any other questions? Or maybe we be overshooting our time. You might be wanting to go visit some beautiful Roman sites. Yes. Mm.
So the ownership of BBC is also very important, given they were also part of his master's government now, or the royal family back in maybe like 70 years ago. So then the relationship of monarchy and BBC is not just black and white, I think. Do you think it still affects the way they report news? Because at least it's unfair to the global sphere, if not equal. So do you think they, at least in the UK, they are reporting fairly, given monarchy?
Yes, I think basically the BBC has its own charter, which spells out very clearly the rules under which it must operate. And it's funded by the license fee that people are obliged, everybody's obliged to pay if they have a television. Its independence is enshrined in its charter. I mean, it has tended, obviously, to be part of the British establishment, very respectful of the monarchy on the whole. But at the same time, they caused great scandals by interviewing Princess Diana. So I think sort of journalistic principles do prevail there, and the system is such that people want it to be independent, and they recognize that. And I mean, I thinking of the sort of ideal spirit of independence of the BBC and other news organisations in the UK. I think of people like Jeremy Paxman, who was a journalist who was sort of young when I was starting out. And in fact, by chance, he one of the big stories that he did that made his name working for Panorama, which is a news, sort of in-depth news program. It was about the Calvi case, and he reconstructed the journey that Calvi made across Europe after leaving, when he fled from Italy. But he was always extremely tough interviewer, and you know, if people didn't answer his question, he would just repeat it over and over again. It was a very intimidating individual, but representing what the public wanted to know. I don't think it was necessarily him, but one of the anecdotes that people tell about the sort of most aggressive, combative journalists, their sort of philosophy when they interview an important person or a politician, the question that they ask themselves at the beginning as they start out is, why is this lying bastard lying to me? And you know, that helps to, you know, keep your independence from the powerful people on the other side of the microphone. So any last questions? Or I think I understand that our session was to last for an hour, and we've probably overrun a bit. So I think unless we're waiting for someone to come and release you, I can release you if there are no more questions. Anyway, good luck with whatever you choose to do, and especially if you go into journalism. I wish you the best of luck with it. It can be very satisfying and rewarding, if not financially, in terms of quality of life.